Everybody, welcome to the Del Norte Solid Waste Management Authority meeting this beautiful, wonderful Crescent City day. We're going to call the meeting to order. Could you please take the roll?
Commissioner Tompkins.
Yes.
Commissioner Inscore.
I'm here.
Commissioner Greeno.
Here.
Commissioner Howard.
Present.
Chair Cowan.
Here. And great. And with that, we are going to take public comment. Any member of the public may address the Solid Waste Management Authority on any matter on or off the agenda. After receiving recognition from the chair, please give your name, address, and for the record, and comments will be limited to 3 minutes. Do we have any public comment at this time? Seeing none, we will move on to open session items.
Did you do the pledge before I
I
got
did
here?
not. I walked right past that. How would you like to lead us in that?
No, I'm fine with it either way, but I'd be happy to. Ready, and begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, right. I just had to stand up again.
It's all like right in here.
Yeah, I know it.
That's why you came, isn't it?
Well, that's it.
Exactly.
That's my only purpose. That and Santa.
So item number 1 is the consent agenda. We have 5 items on the consent agenda for approval.
Move to approve.
Second.
I have a motion and second. Is there any public comment on consent agenda items 1.1 through 1.5? Seeing none, can you pull the vote, please?
Commissioner Howard.
Yes.
Commissioner Greeno.
Yes.
Commissioner Tompkins.
Yes.
Commissioner Inscore.
Yes.
Chair Cowan.
Yes. Okay, moving on. We got treasurer's report items 2.1 through, we'll go with the director's report.
Yes. Thank you, Chair Cowan. So continuing with the director's report, our facilities continue to be operated without a penny of taxes, and we have the lowest rates in the region. We will be closed on Thanksgiving, Thursday, the 28th of November. Recology Del Norte customers who normally have collections on Thursday or Friday will have their collections delayed by 1 day. Looking over briefly the consent agenda items, you did authorize payment of our annual permit fee to the Regional Water Quality Control Board. A few years back, we applied for a reduction, and that reduction has continued to yield benefits. And since the first time we applied that reduction, had we not applied, we would have, over the last 4 years, paid an additional $187,190. So that was a good level of effort and continues to yield benefits.
Yeah.
Well worth it. Looking on down, let's see. We'll take the other agenda items that are specifically there. A good portion of today's meeting will be looking at the requirements of SB 1383, which is to reduce short-term climate pollutants. A previous board meeting, the board gave me direction to work with our legislative representatives to advocate for a different strategy of compliance. But in the context of that, I want you all to understand what it is currently that we would be required to do if the legislation does not change. Also, just attached to the director's report, I thought it was kind of interesting. Of the people who searched for the Del Norte Solid Waste Management Authority website to try to find directions to the transfer station, officially, we are known as the dump.
Yeah.
It's verified. 62.5% of the people who search for our facilities look for the Crescent City dump. Just knowing how we're, and it does fit into context of a recommendation I've heard over the years by many people, which is the consideration that we change the name of the agency just because it is not easily remembered.
We've heard a very similar argument between searching for Del Norte County versus Crescent City. There's recognizable and there's not so recognizable.
Yeah. So I'm not advocating, I'm just sharing that.
I
and-
love the fact that you're sharing because I think we'd see similar results.
Yeah, the dump, the Crescent City dump. It's okay, we live here.
Yes, we do.
Moving on, looking at the financial reports, we have $1,077,041 in the bank, plus the $198,000 as last month's rent. Finances Kathy Brewer is doing a good job keeping our accounts up to date. I guess I'll note that the one account that is over 90 days overdue is actually the Forest Service grant that we're running, so we just need to bill them for those services. AR summary. Again, looking at the claims approved by director, the largest expense, as always, is to Hambro WSG for the good services they provided to Delaware County Transfer Station, and also, as consistent in prior months, the second largest expenses are essentially for the debit credit machine. Running the cards is a cost to the agency. Looking at our financial summary reports, I include the last 2 months' summary reports.
He's got a
Yes.
question regarding.
On the, and I don't know where the summary sheet fits into, have you come to the split sheet yet, or is that after the
No,
summary?
it's the perfect time.
So
yes.
I just have a question about the notation at the bottom of the split sheet at line 31, where it says cash shortage, $47.65.
Yes.
And
Yes.
what that is.
An excellent question. You'll see the note next to it, there was a cash shortage, which essentially means that a customer came and they unloaded their materials, and then they found they didn't have enough cash to pay the bill. And so that amount was actually collected the following day. But on this month's totals, it indicated that
So
we
that
were...
was because it was on the 31st, then it'll show next month that we'll have a cash overage?
That's exactly correct, sir.
Thank you.
And you look for that.
I probably will. Sorry.
No, we want to make sure it's there. Putting it on you.
Major on the minutia, sorry. Okay, thank you, Mr. Wu.
Thank you. So overall, our cash is doing pretty well, but that's fairly typical for this time of the year. We're just finishing up the summer months. And so for our authority revenues at the transfer station, we're $97,799 ahead of budget. And for franchise fees, we're $10,736 ahead of budget. So overall, we're $108,535 ahead of budget, and $1,578 ahead of last year where we were at this time. Again, the winter months will be slower, so we'll see, we'll dip into reserves as those months proceed. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for our director? Gentlemen, nothing? Okay.
Okay, moving on. The next item is just a letter from CalRecycle indicating that they've reviewed the report submitted by Stillwater Sciences. It was originally prepared by County Engineer Jim Barnes. CalRecycle said, since the county is the property owner at the landfill, you need an engineer that's a little further removed. Stillwater Sciences reviewed that work, resubmitted it. CalRecycle has now said it's fine, and we're just waiting for final approval from the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board and the LEA, and then we can bring it back for final approval by this board. So that's a status report.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, next item is also a status report. This is the status report regarding negotiations with Recology Del Norte for the possible extension of their franchise. And under item 4.1, you'll see a summary of the different elements of the agreement that we agree need to be modified or changed. And then we divvied up the tasks of who's going to draft which sections of those agreements. So we are looking at revised language, and we're all contributing. So that's where we are in the process. Our staff is drafting the section saying authority staff will draft, and Recology is drafting the other sections. I'd be happy to answer any questions, but that is the status, and the intent is that once we have those documents to review, we'll meet together with the ad hoc again, and then meet together with Recology to finalize the language before bringing it back to the board.
Any questions?
I have a question. Which CPI are you guys using? Are you using the Los Angeles CPI?
We use the CPI-U, the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers. And that's been called out both in our contract with Recology as well as our contract with Hambro WSG.
Okay.
Okay. 5.1 is also a status report, but it's a significant effort, just letting you know. We have to do our annual permit review the Del Norte County Transfer Station, just as we had to do the permit review for the Crescent City landfill. So every 5 years, they review these documents. And so we've now prepared those documents as summarized in the letter of transmittal and handed those over to Huamua, who is the local enforcement agent, and he started his review of that 5-year permit review. I don't anticipate any significant changes. Essentially, this is an opportunity for us to update the documents to indicate current practices.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on the permit process? No? Okay. Moving on to 6.1.
Moving on, 6.1. This is a follow-up to a suggestion Commissioner Inscore made last meeting. As we were talking about the delays in some of our financial reports, we talked about how we can modify our staffing to address that challenge. In discussing this with Kathy Brewer and others in the staff, we think this is the best strategy to not adversely impact the authority's budget and to also increase capacity. Essentially, what we would be doing is we would take an existing refuse site attendant and we would be training them to do some of the accounting paperwork tasks. And then we would be also guaranteeing them 40 hours a week and that they could also be on call, which is an assigned standby position so that if something goes wrong at the gate, they've always got a backup. And so staff recommendation is that the board approve the attached job description, that we add an office technician to solid waste to the authority organization chart, and we initiate an internal recruitment process to fill this position. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions, gentlemen?
I don't necessarily have any questions. I do think that providing an opportunity where there is some sense of opportunity for advancement within the agency is a good thing, so that you don't get hired to a position and that's the only place that you're ever going to be. So I think that along with the opportunities to cross-train and maybe even evaluate that on a ongoing basis of how we're structured is a good thing. Yes. I think it empowers our employees to believe that there is something more that they can aspire to within our agency, and I think that's a win for all of us.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'd just like to, I noticed that you currently you're down 2 people, right? So you currently have 2 positions open, and if we do this, then you're going to be recruiting somebody out of that with additional duties. Will that put even more strain on the staff that's left for the
An excellent question. We currently have an open recruitment for a refuse site attendant position, and the personnel department has just been reviewing the stacks of applicants. Okay. So yes, we're trying to respond to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else from you two?
Again, the need.
The need. The primary need is that we have more customers going through the Del Norte County Transfer Station. And so we have just 2 people in our accounting department, the account clerk for solid waste and the administrative assistant. And so their job duties include preparing the opening banks, mm-hmm. balancing the daily receipts, okay. Making sure we have timely deposits. Mm-hmm. And all of this has more of a daily deadline to it than most of our other activities, in part because when statements need to go out, when invoices need to go out, they need to go out near the first of the month. It's not okay to be several days out because people plan on making those payments at the first of the month. And if we're a few days late in those invoices, then our payments come in late.
So I'm just taking a look at overall expenses.
Absolutely.
Whenever we want to add a full-time FTE.
I totally agree with that. And so let me...
get concerned.
Can I address how I think about those?
Okay.
So you're absolutely right. Adding another full-time position is a significant addition. Currently, as was pointed out, we have 2 open positions. My thought is that adding this additional position at this point in time makes sense mostly in light of the Northern Transfer Station. However, obviously we don't have that facility open now. So we wouldn't hire that extra position. So I don't anticipate that we would hire so that we're fully staffed with 11 people until that northern transfer station comes around. But essentially, the option would be to establish this office tech position and eliminate one of the refuse site attendant positions, or to not create the position. Or to, after eliminating that position, possibly creating a new position later when the northern transfer station opens. That's fine. Mostly, the main impact is in terms of the challenge to the budget, because when budgeting, I have to budget that as if it's a fully staffed position. And so that does make the annual budgeting process just a little bit more challenging, but I'm willing to take that on, and thinking that in terms of overall fiscal management, we'll address that by simply not hiring out the full staffing chart.
From a position control, why can't we add this position and simply identify one of the refuse site positions as zero? Then from a budget standpoint, it's just zero right now. It's not 1.0, it's not 0.75, it's not 0.5. It's in position control, and so you have, right now we have 4, how many positions are in refuse site? Is it 6 or 5?
It is currently 6 positions.
So you leave that at 5,
That-
5.0, and then you add this position just above it at 1.0. Budgetary wise, there's a smaller impact because this is going to be the pay rate is just above that, but you leave one of those positions as zero, with the idea that we leave that in position control, because when we open the Northern Transfer Center, we need a position. And then we'll have to fund that based on, and the challenge with that is why I think it's good to keep it there, and maybe even to leave it, is that we already know with what happens in Gasky and Klamath, that those outlying transfer stations are not going to pay for themselves.
That's correct.
And so, in some ways, if we're committed already all in on that we're going to have a Northern County transfer station, why not begin budgeting for the staffing of that now? We know it's going to cost us money to have that. So beginning to take those intermediate steps to think about the staffing costs now from a budgetary standpoint, even though we're not having to pay it, seems like a good first step in providing the foundation for that reality. Because I hope that we're not going to yield to the cost of that when it comes right down to it. It's not going to pay for itself. I mean, I don't, maybe it will. Maybe the volume there will be high enough, but the other two don't. So that's just my thought, is why it makes sense to leave it from a budgetary standpoint, because we're going to have to put it there.
Anyways.
Yeah. Maybe not next year, but the year after.
Yeah, I don't know how close we are to it. It seems to me it's not prudent at this time to include it as a budget line item, whether it's a 0.0 or not. I guess my concern is still going back to the question I asked Director, is need. And he referenced your interest in this specific from a fiscal accounting standpoint. I want to hear more about that.
I think that there's two things. I think that the need of being able to say that if we increase the responsibilities and the ability of a refuse site attendant, so that there's things, administrative type things, that they can complete before they get to the office, or can bring them to the office and get those done, that takes that off of our account clerk, that frees her up to do more things for our administrative assistant, that makes sense for what I would consider to be kind of an incremental increase in pay. It's not a huge increase in pay.
Why wouldn't at that point, though, if it's just going to be incremental, why wouldn't we just have overtime allowable to allow that piece of the work to get done instead of bringing on a full-time position for it?
And we could do that. The difference is that the expectations of the responsibilities that I think that Mr. Ward is articulating are not included in that person's job description.
That's it.
And so if we don't redefine the job description to include that, would we change everybody's job description to include that? Which it would be another way of doing it,
Yes.
and cross-train all refuse site attendants to be able to perform these duties, and then treat it, is it, I don't know. I don't know whether or not that's
I really
feasible.
appreciate the discussion because these are exactly the same issues that we've discussed in-house. And essentially, our conclusion about cross-training everybody is that it really it's a very consistent task, and it's a cyclical monthly need. So what we're anticipating is that if the board approves this office tech position, this person, their main job would be a refuse site attendant.
Define for me cyclical monthly need. Are we talking, how many days per month are we dealing with? Is this an everyday task?
The daily accounting tasks are everyday tasks. However, there's definitely a crunch around the beginning and ending of the month. And
That cannot be dealt with OT. It has to be dealt with a full-time position.
This isn't while this is a full-time position, this is not a full-time accounting position. Their main job is still going to be refuse site attendant, but they're going to be doing extra specific accounting tasks to bring them to full-time. Currently, a refuse site attendant position is full-time at 35 hours. So part of what has happened is
So it's
that
5 extra hours a week. So
Right.
basically what
Exactly.
you're saying is this person's going to spend an hour a day providing extra assistance on for the financial department.
And they will be able to be scheduled accordingly. So, for instance, there may be some days during the month when they're doing all accounting tasks. There may be a week during the month that they're doing nothing but accounting
Well,
tasks.
since that position is currently 35 hours, as I'm seeing here, right? You now make it a 40-hour week. You allow folks to compete for that job description internally, but we eliminate a refuse site attendant position for this new piece of the job.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem with eliminating it. My rationale was simply looking to the future, and I know that there you could make the argument either way. I guess my thought about leaving it on the books is the fact that we need to start making that commitment. I want to see us making strides to making that commitment to that Northern County transfer station, and the best way to show that you're committed to it is to start budgeting for it. And we're going to have to figure out a way to budget for it from the standpoint of operations, construction, all those things. This seemed like to me, but I don't disagree with you. Taking it off the books right now is not going to change anything because we're not going to be paying for it anyway. I was just thinking
Understood.
of making
Yep.
sort of making a statement
I'm
about our
following you,
commitment.
but yeah, I think it's premature.
Sure,
That's
but that's
just-
fine. I'm fine with taking.
And staff is okay either way, with whether you want
I
to
think if we
reduce a refuse site attendant position or not, either
Yeah,
way is fine.
replace one of the refuse site attendants with this new refuse site / office tech. I think it needs to be defined as refuse site / office tech, not just office tech, because it's not just an office tech.
Correct.
I mean, it's primarily a refuse site attendant with additional duties.
That's right.
Maybe it's refuse site 2.
I'd be more comfortable.
Or something like that there's extra responsibilities, because anybody that's applying for this, if you went looking and you saw an office tech, you're going to assume that you're sitting in an office, which you're not.
Nope.
That's
So
absolutely,
maybe
you're
we-
correct.
Maybe redefine it as refuse site 1 and refuse site 2, and simply take that one off the other one off the books. It makes sense.
Yep. Okay.
So,
That's where I'm headed.
okay.
So what I hear you guys saying that is you're good with the position, you just want to recreate the name of it, restate the name of it, and, but you do not want to keep that extra site, it's going to replace one of them.
Right.
Right, so
Change the
our
name of one, so
our
it's still
total
be at 2.
staffing of the agency would
Right.
be 10.
Okay, everybody's
I'm
good with that?
No, I'm fine.
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, you've got direction.
Thank you.
Do we need to go to public comment for that?
Any public comment on item 6.1? Okay, seeing none. On to 6.2.
Please, consensus direction needs to be indicated in the minutes, just because this is approving a new position and
I apologize. I
job
thought you had
description
that.
and
So
a
we have
staffing chart change.
Consensus that you're going to keep one on. You're just going to change the name of one of the positions that's already intact.
Yep,
I thought that was pretty
Yep.
clear, Chair.
I thought so.
Well. it's-
Excellent
it's-
discussion.
it's
Thank you.
even
Now
clearer
we have it even clearer. Okay, we good? We got public comment out of the way. We all have clear direction. Discussion, possible action regarding proposals received for assessment, cleanup, vegetation control, and consulting services. Director?
As the board may recall, we did issue an RFP for this earlier and was unsuccessful in securing a contractor in that process. However, we did reissue the RFP and we received one proposal. Staff recommend that we approve negotiating a contract with DDR Consulting and approve appropriate signatures for an amount not to exceed $25,000. I should probably also mention that staff anticipate that the overall value of this contract ultimately will be more than $25,000, but it would have to be extended by board action at some future date.
Can I ask exactly what nature of work we're talking about here?
Absolutely. We did issue a request for proposals that described all of this, but essentially what we're looking for is we have a U.S. Forest Service grant to help do cleanups on Forest Service property. And that grant extends through August 31st, 2021. And while we've had that grant for a few years, it's become abundantly clear that we do not have staff capacity in order to pursue those cleanups or to get that done in time. In addition, we have needs for vegetation control periodically out at the landfill and Gasky and Klamath. And so our thought is that this contractor is able to do cleanups and vegetation control at authority direction. And so there may be, and in addition, for instance, under their grant, the county has recently cleaned up the landfill property, which we very much appreciate. But now we're in a position where we'd very much like to place traffic barriers and signage on that property, and we think this contractor may be particularly helpful in coming up with strategies in that on that front. So this contractor is helping us with cleanups, with vegetation control, and with site control.
Mr. Mason, would you like to say a few words about what's going on before we, or you want to hear from him first, or do you guys have questions, board? Any questions? Let's, yeah, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, as far as the barricade signage and whatnot, I did extensive work on that when I was working for the county, trying to come up with some solutions and never got the funding for it, so that project didn't get completed. So I have extensive knowledge of the challenges and issues and what needs to be done out there. Cleanups, I've been managing cleanups for 25 years, so I have extensive knowledge with that. And vegetation control is simply pruning, weeding, and whacking, so pretty straightforward stuff there. So that's and I did write the original board ordinances back in the day. So as part of my county duties, submitted that. So I'm familiar with all of the ordinances of the Solid Waste Authority. So it kind of puts me in a unique position to do all of these particular items.
Great. Questions?
I have some questions. Obviously, we received a proposal back in July, and then you pulled out of that proposal based on the wage hours that you'd presented previously. And when comparing the wage hours in the current proposal to that proposal, honestly, I don't care if it is grant money. This is hard for me to just go from $65 an hour in management to $98.82. The idea of looking at authority funds to do any work orders, when you're talking about a per person labor hour, your original bid had for $19 an hour, and now we're talking per person $73.71 an hour. I'm not sure what prevailing wage somebody gets $73.71 an hour to abate anything.
Okay,
So I'm very concerned about having one RFP that was responded to, and then the contractor saying, I won't honor that, and then coming back with these numbers. and the backup table that's in here is the exact same table that was in the original, except this time it was not highlighted of which numbers you were using. And in a sense, I guess the one that really sticks at me, besides just the per person per hour for work orders, is the fact that you identified an additional $33.82 just for yourself per hour for what you're going to do. I understand if you looked at the table wrong for hiring somebody else, but to come back a couple months later with another to respond to the RFP and raise your cost, you should have known what your costs are. So I have a real problem with this. And I know that we're sole sourcing this now and we don't have a lot of options, but we have a responsibility to for the trust of public funds, and this just doesn't sit well with me. So maybe you can, I know I came out with both barrels, but I would certainly like to understand the justification of this and what changed.
Certainly. On the original RFP, I had my brother help me with that, and that's kind of what he does for a living, but he's in the middle of a really tenacious divorce and didn't put as much time and effort into it as he could have, and he made a serious error on the wages, so that's what it costs to do the job. There's no profit margin, and there's no workers' comp insurance on the original RFP. So if I did it at that rate, I'd be losing money, bleeding red ink all over the place. So we had to go back and crunch the numbers and talk to my insurance agent and get more accurate numbers on the cost at prevailing wage. If I wasn't doing prevailing wage, I could have done it at the original cost. But because the prevailing wage requires all of these other things, and then the federal, Francis Davis, is even more strict than the state, it is what it is.
So the actual cost is $73, almost $74.
That includes a reasonable profit, yeah. Because of what I have to pay. You have to pay the employees, and I have to pay benefits, and I have to pay the insurance, and it's all mandated. I don't have any wiggle room on that.
What do you mean benefits? You have to pay workman's comp. That's
Yeah,
not a
I have to
benefit.
pay the workman's comp, I gotta pay the employer's share of the social security, I gotta pay
Right,
all
so
the
those
state
aren't
disability.
benefits, those are just, those
Co-
are your
yeah,
your
costs.
compensation
Employer
check.
costs.
Yeah,
those
the
are your
employer cost, overhead, all
So
that,
are
I
you
have to
giving
pay.
them benefits on top of that?
It requires that I compensate them for that. So I don't have a medical plan, but I have to compensate them for it. So it means they get extra money in their paycheck for them to pay for their own insurance. I have to do the equivalent, right? So it breaks down on there how much per hour goes to benefits, retirement, all that, and all that goes into their paycheck. So fortunately, I don't have to pay workers' comp on the benefit portion, because that's not wages, but that's why it's broken down that way on the table. And it's not the same table, it's slightly different because it's the updated one from the Division of Industrial Relations.
So I'm going to have to ask a really stupid question. Catch me up, Director, Mr. Mason. Why are we using prevailing wage again? Is that where the source of the funding is demanding it?
Yes, the Forest Service grant requires that these services be provided by contractors under prevailing wage if they're provided by contractors.
And if I'm looking at this correctly on page 49 of the labor and related classifications codes, we're using that classification code for our area to come up with that hourly rate.
Yes.
Don't you love prevailing wage?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've dealt with this before on several state contracts. And this is not high on the state contracts I've dealt with. This is actually pretty consistent and low. You should see what I have to pay somebody who's a laborer for concrete. But your wage, your compensation, does that fall under prevailing wage also?
As owner of the business, no, it doesn't, but it's like, I really couldn't justify working for less than the people that are working for me. Seriously, it's like, what's the point of being in business if the employees are going to make more than I am?
I don't know, there's a couple business owners
I'm
that
gonna
might
say,
answer
I-
that
I would
question
disagree
differently.
I mean, right, if you can make more than employees,
Yeah.
right?
Let them be the owner.
I'm not a
right?
charitable organization.
Yeah.
I just don't do this for
Understood.
free,
Yeah,
so.
Any other questions for Mr.
No,
Mason?
I'm just, Director, what are our options here? We've gotten pretty far down this process.
Staff recommend approving the negotiating the agreement and signatures. If we don't do this, the challenges of actually fulfilling the terms of that cleanup grant are going to be really challenging because we don't have the staff to do it. And that would be really too bad because
Yeah.
there are materials to be cleaned up. In addition, we have challenges increasingly on fulfilling the requirements to control the vegetation at the landfill because historically we've worked with the CAL FIRE crews out of Alder Camp, and with the more severe fire seasons what we found is that they're not available, and we've been getting violations because we haven't been able to control the vegetation at the landfill because the Alder Camp crews aren't available and we don't have another option. So part of the strategy of developing this RFP was to address those outstanding needs.
And I fully understand where Commissioner Anscor's coming from. My stomach turns when I see this kind of stuff. But,
And to be honest, that's why I didn't catch it the first time, is when we went through the numbers and it's
Well,
like, and then it's like, oh
prevailing
snap.
wage law is a very difficult thing to navigate. As
Yes.
somebody who's gone through it multiple times, I could see where that could happen. I don't see the piece that I asked you about, and Commissioner Anscor asked you about, which is your wage and compensation. But, okay, that's fine. That's for you to put in there. Director, obviously, we need to move forward with something. Chair, with that, I'll make that motion to move forward with the contract.
Okay, I've got a motion
I'll second that.
and a second. Any public comment on item 6.2? Seeing none, clerk, would you please pull a vote?
Commissioner Tompkins,
Yes.
Commissioner Inscore,
Yes.
Commissioner Howard,
Yes.
Commissioner Greeno,
Yes.
Chair Cowan.
Yes. Great, thank you.
Director Ward, I would just ask, and you can certainly look for consensus from the board. I would just ask that before we start doing a lot of work orders at that rate, we explore any possible options that we have to be able to do some of that work. And that's no reflection on Mr. Mason or his company, but obviously if we have options that don't cost us $73 an hour per person, I would much prefer us being able to look for those first, but not at the expense of us being fined or doing the work that needs to be done. I just, so.
Understood and
Thank you.
totally agree.
I'd echo those sentiments.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
We're doing 2-minute break?
Okay.
We good? 6.3.
Item 6.3 is an updated version of the non-disposal facilities element. This is part of our regional agency integrated waste management plan and needs to be updated as part of the 5-year review that the task force is currently engaged in. But this is essentially a document describing all of the facilities that are not landfills that are critical to the continuance of our recovery infrastructure. So it includes our Gasky and Klamath facilities, the Delaware County Transfer Station, as well as the processing facilities used by Recology. So staff recommend approval.
Make that motion.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Do we have any public comment on item 6.3? Seeing none. Could you please pull the vote? Was that you in second?
Commissioner Tompkins,
Yes.
Commissioner Howard,
Yes.
Commissioner Greeno,
Yes.
Commissioner Inscore,
Yes.
Chair Cowan.
Yes. Moving on to item 6.4, discussion and possible action regarding an informational presentation on SB 1383.
Okay, yeah, the yawn is the right attitude, and yet we've got a lot of material to cover, so I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. I want to emphasize that I understood the direction from the authority board that we're to work with our legislators in advocating for a different way to comply with reducing short-lived climate pollutants. But part of the starting point of that is to understand what the existing law would require of us. The good news is that the ESJPA of the Regional Council of Rural Counties has decided that working on this piece of legislation is a legislative priority for them. So we'll be working with their staff, which is a tremendous asset because they have technical expertise, a lobbyist, and they're very familiar with these issues. But I applaud the board for directing me to do this because essentially it was my instigation with the RCRC staff that is driving this consensus that we're building a larger group around. So good direction, but let's understand what it is that's being asked of us. So essentially SB 1383 was passed in 2016. It requires the state to reduce organic waste, including food waste, green waste, and paper products, disposal by 75% by the year 2025. In other words, the state must reduce organic waste disposal by more than 20 million tons by 2025. The law also requires the state to increase edible food recovery by 20% by 2025. So this establishes a statewide target and not a jurisdiction-specific organic recovery goal. So this is a more prescriptive approach, which is different than AB 939, which is normal, what our other programs are. Essentially, we've advocated to Cal Recycle. These are the programs we think make the most sense in our community, and then Cal Recycle sees how we're doing on implementing those programs. This is not like that. This is, you will have a food waste recovery program. It's more like that. So let's go through some of those requirements. So essentially, it requires that each jurisdiction provide organic waste collection to all residents and all businesses. That would mean mandatory collection. That's not what we currently have. Establish an edible food recovery program that recovers edible food from a waste stream. Well, the good news is that the Food Council has a grant to do that, so we're at least a little bit ahead on that. We have to conduct outreach and education to all affected parties, including generators, haulers, facilities, edible food recovery organizations, and city-county departments. We have to plan for the capacity to process these materials. We need to procure recycled organic waste products like compost, mulch, and renewable natural gas. And then, of course, we need to report records and inspect facilities. So when we're talking about organic waste in terms of SB 1383, we're talking about green waste, wood waste, food waste, and also paper and cardboard. So using that framework, organic waste comprises about 2/3 of our waste stream. And according to Cal Recycle's latest waste characterization study, food waste comprised about 18% of what we disposed. Like I said, part of this is to increase recovery of edible food by 20%. Here's what we do know, that 1 in 5 children go hungry every night in California, and so part of the goal of this is to redirect that edible food to alleviate some of those problems. And on the positive side, for every 2.5 tons of food rescued, that's equivalent to taking 1 car off the road for a year. So the drive of this is to try to reduce methane. Methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It's about 72 times more powerful. It's more powerful in the short term. And landfills are the 3rd largest producer of methane. So we're already seeing some of the adverse impacts of climate change. And as a coastal community, this might be of particular concern to us. So this does set aggressive organic waste recovery targets. And like I said, we have the edible food recovery target. So here's some of the timelines. Essentially, you can see that under the current timelines, we would be required to have organics collection, including food waste collection, by the end of 2026. So that's pretty quick for collections of materials that do not have facilities where they might be processed. Because typically, for siting, locating, and opening a facility like this, 5 years would be a very rapid time frame. So this is not leaving a lot of time in general. But like I said, on the positive side, we have the Del Norte and Associated Tribal Lands Food Council's Food Waste Recovery Grant, and since that is part of what we're trying to do, then that should take us a little bit down the road. So looking at some of these dates, essentially we would be required to provide organics collections services to all residents and businesses by 2026. Procurement would start in 2027, and we need to start capacity planning, basically looking at all the facilities that would be necessary to make this happen. So securing access to edible food recovery capacity by 2022, organics recycling capacity by 2024, establishing an edible food recovery program, conducting education and outreach to the community, procuring recyclable and recovered organic products, providing organics collection services to all residents and businesses by the end of 2026, and monitoring compliance and enforcement. So this is not just our agency. This applies to many different departments, both in the city and the county, and the different entities have different responsibilities. So this includes, we need to establish an edible food recovery program for all Tier 1 and 2 edible food waste generators, conducting education and outreach to all of the generators. We would be required to procure certain levels of a compost, renewable gas for transportation fuels, electricity, heating applications, and pipeline injection, or electricity from biomass conversion produced from organic waste. So those are all procurement requirements that would impact not just our agency, but the city and the county as well. So this is the edible food recovery program, and this is similar to what we hope to be working with the Food Council on. And hopefully this will get us making progress on that front at least. The infrastructure requirements are really significant and very underfunded in general. In general, there are about 14 such facilities currently, and CalRecycle estimates that we'll need between 50 and 100 new such facilities in order to comply with these mandates. So again, not much time, and that's one of the complaints that, or at least one of the issues that RCRC has tried to raise to CalRecycle, which is you can want this to happen, but when you talk about siting a facility, we still have all of the processes and the environmental quality things and the community engagement processes to try to figure out where would be the right location, where this would be okay. And that's not an instantaneous process just because you want it to be. So that will be a challenge. moving on, so we have the recycling infrastructure requirements. So let's see, one of the charming things, let's see, so we have all of the education requirements, and then they are, like I said, this law is much more prescriptive than previous laws. So essentially, they'll require that if we just have the 2 container collection service that we currently have, essentially the trash cart would have to go to a place where they could recover the organics. No such facility currently exists. And the other option is to go to a 3 container source separated collection service, but again, we do not have facilities to take those materials from the green cart, and that does not include food waste collection. So these are pretty significant requirements. Procurement requirements, we've got to up the procurement of recycled paper, compost, and mulch. Construction and landscaping requirements. This dovetails a little bit with the Cal Green construction requirements, and that's being implemented by the county. But we'll have to work with them regarding that. And then, of course, we've got inspection and enforcement requirements, and at this point, it's not entirely clear how much of these will be ours and how much of these will be the responsibility of the local enforcement agent. We will have a compliance review. We will have to have 2 or 3 container collection service. And if there's unsegregated collection services, then those businesses need to be subscribed that those materials are being diverted to a high diversion organics waste processing facility, namely that they would need to process the trash and pull out the organics. And again, I emphasize we do not have such a facility on the North Coast. And then you've got enforcement and inspection, including inspection of the food waste generators. So record keeper requirements are also not insignificant. And then you've got Cal Recycle oversight beginning in 2022, where they start to actually do enforcement. We have already sent the letter to our legislative representatives. ESJPA has indicated that they intend to help. We have not yet set up meetings with the legislative representatives because ESJPA is still working through their internal process, trying to figure out who would be the most strategic legislators to be authors of this legislation. So they're really helping us in strategy as well. So those are the overview of the requirements. Again, I emphasize that we will be advocating a different path. We are interested in trying to do what we can to try to reduce short-term climate pollutants. However, I have to say that on the surface of it, food waste collection is not the first thing I would do to try to reduce short-term climate pollutants in Del Norte County. It's just not. However, there are some opportunities that might be available, such as there have been studies from the Marin Carbon Project demonstrating that if you apply a 1/4-inch layer of compost to rangelands that are used for feeding cattle, for instance, that land will continue to sequester carbon for the next 30 years. So one strategy might be to help us be a place where organics that are composted in other areas might be deployed to help sequester that carbon, so that we're addressing the need to address short-term climate pollutants without necessarily establishing new collection programs and new facilities as is currently envisioned within the legislation. There's no question that we will have to do significant efforts on this, both in terms of advocating for the legislation, also in terms of compliance. I'm not exactly sure what all of those efforts are going to be yet, because this is a little bit of a moving target. But because the legislation already does allow for some deferral of some of the collection requirements in rural areas like ours, we hope to use that period of time to craft a different way of compliance. So that's my summary report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sounds like there's a pretty heavy load of work coming down on you, and you're already kind of short-staffed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have staff to do this? Are you going to be able to do a good job of it with the staff you have?
The short answer is probably, if these requirements do not change, we will need more staff to comply with these requirements. That's not our current strategy. Our current strategy is to try to craft something that is a little bit more workable, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if we don't have a greater role to play in trying to address these requirements.
And I honestly, I don't remember where we were in 2016 as far as addressing this legislation. But if there's ever a good illustration of why we need to be advocating for legislation before it becomes law, this is the absolute textbook case of, because both of our representatives on the North Coast voted yes on this. Both Senator McGuire and Assemblymember Wood both voted yes for this. We should have been in their ear. We have a responsibility to our constituents to be lobbying these things that are going to dramatically impact them. Because the bottom line is the one question that has to be asked about this is who's going to pay for it? And ultimately, our ratepayers are going to pay for this because we don't have the money to do this. So while I absolutely believe we need to advocate for exemptions, things that can go back and be amended into the law, we also need to take heed of the importance of being in Sacramento and partnering with RCRC and partnering with the League of Cities, CSAC. We've got to get in front of this kind of stuff before it becomes law. We may not be effective, we may not get there, but if our voice has got to be heard, so that we're not trying to do damage control afterwards. Frustrating.
You're 100% correct. Hindsight's 2020 in this
Yeah.
case. 2016, we were operating in a very siloed fashion, our agencies, and there's a lot of disconnects that basically could have helped advocate at a little higher level if it wasn't just taking an advocacy role out of this shop. It could
Yeah,
have
and it
been
wasn't,
led-
I mean, it's 2014 and 15 when we should have really been working on this.
Exactly.
And
and
you and
there
I
was-
were brand new
there
here
was
then.
distractions in this board.
Yeah.
There was distractions everywhere
Right.
in the county, and we shouldn't have been the only ones focusing on it
Yeah.
either. I
No,
know
you're right.
We're
CSAC
focusing it on now.
CSAC did take a position on it.
And Ted is
was
working well.
supportive. And I don't know how or why that position was taken at the time, but I know who to ask.
But that's in the past. We're working on it now. We brought it to the director's attention. We have concerns about it. I know you're working with RCRC. I'm very happy
So-
that you're taking such an active role in it.
Ted, oftentimes these type of movements emerge with pilot type projects to look at impacts. In this case, there wasn't a pilot project that guided the legislation. And that's a potential position that we could take back to RCRC CSAC in legislative language that would look for amendments. It's not just a small rural argument any longer. Even the suburban and urban centers are not going to have the infrastructure to meet these needs. What are you hearing from the JPA? What are you hearing from RCRC with that kind of thinking? Is there any at this point in time?
The general concern that is most commonly voiced is that Cal Recycle has tried to translate a general requirement of we're going to address short-term climate pollutants in a very aggressive way, and that's been translated into these. You will have these programs in place by this date, and the challenge of that is that doesn't acknowledge any local process for, say, siting a facility, which doesn't happen overnight. And so the plannings for completely transforming the way we handle organic materials, transforming the way we collect them, establishing a whole addition of food waste recovery facilities in addition to markets for those materials. It's a very big lift on a very aggressive timeline. And that's mostly the feedback that they're getting. And the other side of it is that it's very prescriptive. And namely, it's you will do this, you will do this, you will do this. And there isn't really a venue for saying, in our area, that doesn't make a lot of sense. There are some angles on that, but not much. For instance, there's a provision in there that above 4,000 feet, you can make a pitch that maybe food waste collection wouldn't make sense because you have bears. And I got to inform them that we actually have bears on the coast at sea level, and they don't look at what elevation they're at to be here. So those kind of reality checks are something that we're going to continue to work through. But by being constructively engaged about here's what we think might make sense in our area, I think that will give us the best movement forward. The other side of this is that because it is a statewide requirement, the state's trying to recover 75%. Part of our argument will be the rural areas do not represent a huge fraction of that. And the cost to provide these levels of programs in the rural areas is that much more. And we all have things you're trying to balance. When you're looking at, can we staff another person in the sheriff's office? Can we make our streets a little bit better maintained? Those are balancing act, real cost questions. And we do not have I'm not confused, we don't have an infinite amount of resources just to spend on solid waste and composting issues.
So sometimes the best way to approach it is thinking about the cost of implementation of a plan like this for a small rural, whether it's you, Mendocino, Humboldt. You're putting together a budget that reflects the requirements of law. I know it's a time-consuming process, but at the same time, it helps you with an informed decision-making process that you could then carry with you to a JPA meeting. You could have us advocating for you at both the city and the county levels at those same sites with senator, with assemblyman. Talk to me about a strategy that would assist you in putting that together, potentially.
We could hire a contractor to do that analysis. As I just went over, you can see ours is not the only agency involved in this. And when you start talking about, say, siting a facility and the cost of developing a facility, there are some significant uncertainties in estimating those costs. But you're absolutely correct, and that's what RCRC is specifically asking for, is like, they really want to know folks who are assessing and projecting those costs. And in all honesty, as we're trying to understand this, it's difficult to play all angles, namely to have the time and capacity to plan what it would take to comply with the law, to understand the law, and to advocate for something different, all in the same person. Unfortunately, the law is too big for that.
And I think that's a reasonable request. That's a great idea. I would love to hear this commission come up with some consensus to give direction to staff to put together either an RFP if necessary or a sole source to an agency or a private consultant that could put together those numbers for small rural.
I could develop that RFP, yes.
Okay.
But it wouldn't be cheap.
That's okay. So that's my
Well, I mean,
concern. Where is it going to
you're going to do something like that. You might as well just plan that you're going to spend $20,000-$30,000 for somebody to evaluate this. But if we're talking about something that may be a 50% increase to our annual operating costs, then spending the $25,000-$30,000 or whatever it is to get out in front of this to really be able to make our case is money. And I don't like spending money on consultants, but this is too big.
Well,
to not have our ducks in a row to be able to say, and this is the impact to Delaware County. It's going to cost us $500,000 a year. There is no funding coming to us to this, and we would be forced to translate all that onto our ratepayers, and that's why we're here saying it doesn't work. And without that document in hand, I don't know how we do that other than say, well, poor us, we
Commit your
can't
time
do
to
it.
I think that, again, excellent discussion. So what I would recommend, based on the tone of this discussion, is that I'll work with RCRC and their representatives to essentially work with them to, what information is going to be most useful
Sure.
in advocating for this case.
I like it.
So then you can craft the RFP.
And then we'll
Right.
use that as the basis for crafting the
Right.
RFP, and I'll bring it back to the board before we release
That
that.
sounds great. Is everybody up here in tune with that?
Absolutely.
I've seen
Great.
$30,000+ spent on far less value.
Yeah, that's
Right.
a good point.
Right.
Thank you.
Very good point. Okay, do you have, go ahead.
I do have one question.
Yes.
You said that RCRC sent letters to our legislators.
No, we sent the
Oh,
letters
we
to the
sent letters.
legislators, but
Did-
I have not followed up with those. Normally, when I send a letter, I follow up with a phone call and start setting up meetings. But because we want to work with RCRC and I defer to their expertise in this front, I want to make sure we're all on the same page and they will advocate as to who would be the best authors to
So
actually.
we haven't heard back from anybody.
But we're not ready, we want to be ready for the conversation so that when we sit down with the legislators, we can say, all right, here's what we're talking about.
Okay.
We're
makes
bringing to
sense.
them something more concrete than just concepts.
Great,
That
great.
makes sense.
Thank you,
Yes.
Mr. Ward.
Thank you.
If I could just make one point, I was just looking at SB 1383, and it's actually, that legislation is very broad and sets forth goals, and it directs Cal Recycle to come up with regulations to implement those and come up with these programs and requirements. So it wasn't the actual SB 1383 that set forth a lot of these specific regulations. It's the implementing regulations through Cal Recycle that have gotten very detailed and.
Yeah,
So I just wanted to
exactly.
clarify that these actual rules, weren't around in 2015, 2016.
Yeah, the issue is the delegation of legislative power to
To Cal Recycle.
to Cal Recycle. That's the problem.
In this case, yeah, which means that if the law doesn't mandate these things, we still have advocacy, and you get enough pushback. Cal Recycle's got enough problems, I mean, just trying to manage everything else. If this is going to create a firestorm, is creating a firestorm for them. That's why I think we have got to, and having legislative push that says, this is not what we crafted in law. You have convoluted the law with all of your regulations and timelines, and that is not what we voted for.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
so,
Okay,
That's why RCRC is willing to help.
it's good,
right.
good work.
Yeah,
They supported something that wasn't what they thought it was going to be. Right. Okay, you have direction on that?
I do, thank you.
Great, okay.
Very good.
We're going to move on to item 6.5, discussion and possible action regarding the director's vacation. We talked about this last week.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Great. We've got a motion and a second. Any public comment on 6.5? Seeing none, can you please pull the vote?
Commissioner Tompkins?
Yes.
Commissioner Howard?
Yes.
Commissioner Greeno?
Yes.
Commissioner Inscore?
Yes.
Chair Cowan?
Yes, perfect. Moving on to closed session. We will see you when we're done.
We don't expect you to report on anything we're doing.
No, we won't be reporting out, are we at all?
You
No,
have to wait for
nothing.
us.
So, yeah, there will be no reportable items coming out of closed session. So we will see everybody next month. Do we have a meeting next month? Is that, are we dark? We do. Okay. I won't be here.